In this tutorial, we're going to go over the process of entering sample information and then submitting and creating a sample number in NUTBAL Online. And before we do that, just a quick note: when you're thinking about submitting samples and taking a fecal sample, that sample is actually the representation of a herd as well as that pasture. And so it's going to, in a way, represent the herd in terms of the performance projections based on their nutritional status, and then as well as the pasture quality in terms of the grazed forage that's being utilized by the animals in that pasture. So again, it's good to have your animal profiles and your pastures ready to go before we start to do the sample description. And then if you're going to collect samples, we're not going to go over that in this video. We actually have a video on our YouTube and Facebook pages that goes over the process of collecting and mailing that manure sample. But basically, when you go out, you're collecting a representation of all of the animals in that herd and using that pasture that you're going to be pairing with our sample description here on NUTBAL Online. So to get started, once you're logged in, you'd go to the Samples tab and then you'd click on Descriptions. And that's going to take you to the new sample creation page. This sample description page is the equivalent of filling out that physical sample sheet that comes with your sample boxes. And all of the information that I'm going to go over today, a lot of that is going to also be described on the info packet that's included with your sample boxes and sample sheets. And one thing to highlight as we're entering this info is all of the information that we're going to provide with the sample description that plays into your animal performance projections, and these parameters, they determine the individual animal protein and energy requirements, and that's going to then relate the forage quality data taken from your fecal sample into your NUTBAL report. And once the sample description has been filled out, it will be given a unique number. Either if it's filled out online by you, it'll show up here when you're finished entering your sample description, or we'll create the number here if you've submitted a handwritten sample sheet, and we'll actually go through NUTBAL Online and enter those things on our end. When you're making a new sample, the first thing that you have to do is check this Select Sample First drop-down line, and it's going to be, if you just click on the page, ready to go with a new sample, but you want to confirm that it says New Sample. The next thing that you need to do before you can really do anything else is select the date that you collected your fecal sample. If you don't select a date, it won't really let you move on with any of this information. If you are selecting to do an advisory report, so that's the standard NUTBAL report with the performance projections and diet quality, as well as a feeding recommendation, you can select to do that here. You just would check that. And then you can move on to actually describing the livestock that comprise your herd that you sampled from. Right now, it says that no profiles have been added. You see this big red line. And so that's just saying that you haven't associated any of your previously made animal profiles with this sample. So the first thing you'll do is you'll go down under the second red bar and you'll select one of your animal profiles that you have previously created. Once you've selected your profile, the next thing you'll do is just skip this comment section for now and just go straight to animal category. And for the most part, if you're just doing a adult cow, it's going to say mature. If you're entering information for a male animal, it will let you choose if it's a steer or still a bull. And if it's a really young animal or a heifer, you can choose post-puberty, which isn't quite mature, but she's reproductive, or spayed, which we of course don't use very often for cattle. So let's go back to a mature cow. And another thing you'll notice is if you pick a profile that had comments previously in the comments portion of the animal profile description, that will auto-populate your comments here, and you can erase that or add or change that if you need to. But again, you want to go to category first and select the appropriate one. And then you'll notice some of these fields auto-populate. The comments would have already, and the number of head already from your animal profile information, and both of those can be changed here if they've changed since you've created that animal profile. And then it will also have generated default body condition score, frame scores, and weights based on the breed information that we have in our breeds library. And it will assume a body condition score of 5 because that's our standard kind of reference weight. So you'll see here standard reference weight is kind of the typical weight of an animal in average body condition at their average frame score. And these are all adjustable as well. So the frame score refers to the skeletal size of this animal profile. The body condition score refers to a visual measurement of fatness that you can use, and this is on a 1 to 9 scale. And if you're not familiar with determining frame scores or body condition scores, we have some tools on our GanLab website. You could go to our publications. There are some helpful tips, as well as a body condition scoring tool and a frame score reference link to help you with that. Another tool that NUTBAL has built in is that the frame score, the body condition score, and the weight are all linked together. So if you adjust the frame score or the body condition score, the weight will change to reflect that. So if you don't know their exact weight, but you know the frame score and body condition score, it'll estimate the weight for you. Or if you do know the weight, it's going to adjust the body condition score to reflect the weight that you've entered. So what we normally recommend is to choose the 2, weight, body condition, or frame. Choose 2 out of these 3 that you know the best, and then let NUTBAL calculate the 3rd for you. The next steps would be to enter the days lactating or days pregnant for that group of animals. If those animals, even if they're the same profile, similar in age and breed, if they might be a mix of lactating and pregnant, so if they're at the end of their gestation and some have already calved, you might consider making 2 separate profiles, one for the lactation days or one for the pregnant days. That way the different nutritional requirements are going to be represented. Or you can choose to just do the lactating animals, as those are going to be the ones with the higher nutritional requirements needed. And if you have a desired performance goal in terms of daily gain, you can add that here. If these animals require a certain amount of pounds per day to maintain their current score, so if they're growing and they need to gain every day in order to keep up with their growth and maintain their current body condition, it's going to auto-populate this with a daily gain, just to maintain the body condition score that you've put in here. And you could adjust that to meet the performance that you want. But again, if you see a auto-generated number, or if you've submitted a physical sample sheet that you had 0, but NUTBAL puts a number there whenever you're looking at your NUTBAL report, it's probably because you have a growing animal or an early lactating staged animal that needs to be gaining weight and has a higher energy requirement in order to maintain their current body condition. Internal parasite load is an approximate estimation of stress on your animal in terms of stomach worms or lung worms. You can select from low, moderate, and high, and most of our clients we see low for the internal parasites if you're on a good deworming and parasite control regimen. External parasite load is the same, low, moderate, high options, and that's going to refer to flies or ticks or other sort of external parasites. And this one we might see moderate or high. depending on the time of the year, just because of the flies. And finally, if you're using a growth implant, you can choose from the closest option to the one that you're using. And so once this has all been filled out, you can hit Add Profile, and you'll see this brown row that has appeared across the top of this table, and that shows that you have added this profile and it's now going to be associated with this new sample. And you can add multiple profiles, you can go back and you can edit this profile or remove it. And if you have a profile selected but you want to create a new one, all you have to do is go to this drop down. So I'm going to add a new profile or another profile to this sample really quickly. And so when there's two profiles or more than one, you'll see an added row for each added animal profile. And it'll give you a small summary of some of the parameters that you entered before. The next step after entering your animal profiles would be to connect the sample to a previously made pasture. So you'd go to the second Pastures tab. And again, I'd skip the comments right away and just go right down to this Pasture drop down. And you can select one of your previously made pastures, and then you can enter additional pasture information to reflect its current growth status, so how quickly grass is growing, and that's going to factor into the amount of grass available for grazing. And so we have three options, basically a low or no growth, a medium growth, and a high growth. So declining, dormant, drought, flowering, seeding is our medium growth, and then rapid growth is high. If your animals are consuming ionophore through a feed, you would actually add that here, and you would just select the most appropriate ionophore based on the dosage, and then the days in your grazing period. So how many days your animals are going to be on this pasture before you move them. And this again will also factor into the amount of grazable forage. One note about this comments section, this comments field has a pretty high character limit, and so if you have any additional comments about maybe the state of your pasture, recent weather, or just other pertinent info about your sample that you would like to describe, this comments field is actually a good place to do that. It'll show up, the information logged here will show up on your NUTBAL report, so you can refer to it there as well. And once you've entered livestock and pasture information, even if you have feeds you're going to add, and we'll get to that in a second, I always, after pasture, hit Save Description, because you need to have that pasture information in there to create this new sample number. So you see this pop up, and this is going to be a notification that you've created a new sample, and it's going to give you the instructions for mailing that sample and a unique sample number that is created for all of the sample information. It links it all together. And we use this number to track the sample once it arrives and as it moves through the different processing stages in our lab. And once you see that the sample number has been created and you get these pop-ups, you'll know that you've successfully submitted your NUTBAL sample description. And you can always go back and edit the information that you just described and add to it, which we're going to go back and do here in a minute. But this is just kind of a confirmation to know that that sample was successfully put through into the NUTBAL Online system. If you hit closed, it just takes you to this sample form pop-up. That's just the condensed summary of everything you've entered so far in your sample description, and you could print it out from here and put it with your sample. But if you're not done yet, all you have to do is exit out of there, and it'll put you right back to where you were before. So the next tab is the Feeds tab. And before we get started adding feeds, I just want to talk a little bit about how NUTBAL Online looks at the added feeds. So when we analyze your fecal sample for forage quality, that's going to reflect the forage diet consumed by the animals 36 to 48 hours prior to taking that sample, or essentially prior to that animal defecating. So in its calculations for diet quality and nutrient intake, NUTBAL Online first considers the forage quality from the fecal NRS scan, and then it's going to add in nutrients contributed from supplemental feeds that you would add on this page. As a principle, our NRS fecal analysis is meant to be used for forage-based diets and to be a tool for determining forage quality in those extensive grazing systems, and not a confined, highly supplemented system. Our analysis can tolerate moderate levels of concentrate supplementation and the changes that will cause in the fecal chemistry, but if it's possible, we recommend to discontinue supplementation of any concentrates 2 to 3 days prior to sampling for the most accurate prediction of forage quality in your pasture. When we're going to add feeds, you always want to include the supplements that are going to be fed over the following 30 days. If you were feeding them at the time of the sample and up to your sampling, but you are choosing to no longer feed them, you don't necessarily need to add them, because if you're not going to feed them over the next 30 days, where our performance projections will fall, then it would be more accurate to not include those added nutrients. And then vice versa, if you're planning to start feeding right after you've taken your sample and before you get a report back from us, you would want to add in the feed that you're thinking about feeding to see its potential added effect. Mineral supplements that have little protein or energy contribution to their diet do not need to be added, and so you won't find an option to describe those. And that's just because NUTBAL Online works off of protein and energy macronutrient requirements for their animal performance. We don't analyze for vitamin and mineral status. And then finally, if they're on hay, it doesn't necessarily need to be added into the system as a feed. We have hay options, but really it's best to just leave a note in the sample description comments under that Pastures tab if you're feeding hay. If the hay is not removed 48 hours before taking your sample, the diet quality predicted in the fecal sample is going to reflect the hay's contribution to overall forage quality, because that hay is going to show up chemically as a grass or forage constituent of that cattle's diet. If you would like to evaluate the pasture forage only, so to see what your pasture looks like without any of the hay that you're offering, then you would want to remove the hay from the animals at least 48 hours before sampling, just so that that fecal sample truly represents just the grazed forage intake. The only time you might want to add a hay is if you want to know what adding in hay will do to overall diet quality, or if you're feeding a certain amount of hay maybe once a week or twice a week, and the animals are fully consuming that in one day, and then they're going several days without the hay. Once you're ready to start adding feeds, it looks a lot like the livestock tab before, where we have this table and it starts out with this red row that no feeds have been added. And so you go down below the red row, like before, and you choose from this feeds drop down, and we have a loaded library of many types of feeds, and you would select the one that most closely represents your supplement. So if you're feeding a specific cube or cake, that you could just choose. We have a couple generic options like this cow cake. We have a generic tub, a textured feed, and then a generic molasses-based liquid. And so you can adjust protein and energy in terms of total digestible nutrients according to the feed that you're feeding. And crude protein can always be found on a feed tag. Unfortunately, TDN, total digestible nutrients, is not often put on feed tags. If you a lot of times call a feed company or get that feed tested, that would be available on those reports. However, a lot of times we just recommend using our default value from our feeds library. The next option is cost, and it's actually, these all say optional. Cost is optional too. NUTBAL will automatically generate a sort of a cost analysis based on the amount you're feeding and the cost per day it is to feed that. So if you wanted to put in a cost for what it takes to acquire that feed, and then if you have an estimation that you want to add on to distribute that feed, you would enter that. And then the next is going to be the amount fed. And I actually recommend, if just going over to this right, and this option will describe the rate of what you're feeding. And you should select that first, because if you, for instance, select the amount fed and you're like, oh, I actually do that every 2 days, it will double it for you, and a lot of times it won't catch that, and then they'll add it and it actually doubles up their feed. And then I'll hit a little bit more on feed mediation reports in another tutorial, but you can actually add a range for the amount that you're feeding or that you would be willing to feed. So the minimum amount that you would feed for it to be worth your while of actually purchasing and having and storing that feed, and then the max amount that you're willing to feed, kind of your economic boundaries for utilizing this feed. And then finally, percent wasted. You can estimate that based on if their animals are consuming every little bit that you're getting out there, or if some of it's getting trod into the ground or not fully utilized. And it's going to automatically default for 1. It won't let you select 0. So again, if you've done a physical sample form and you see that there's a 1% wasted, that's just because NUTBAL automatically starts at 1%. So once you've entered all of these fields, you'd hit Add Feed, and it would show up again as a brown row in this table. And you can go down and add any additional feeds. And again, they'd show up as several different rows. If you needed to remove a feed, you would just click on that feed that you would like to take off and go down here and hit Remove. You can always go back and edit information about a feed you previously entered by clicking on it, and then going down here if you want to change the protein or change the amount. After you make an edit down here, hit Add Feed again, and it will change the edit and save it to that sample information. So I've changed the amount fed, Add Feed, and then it changes it up here as well. And now that you have your sample number created, I like to hit save just about any time I make any significant changes. It's not going to do the big pop-up with the sample form anymore. It's just going to save it, and so it's a pretty quick thing. So if you go back to your livestock or pasture information and change information there, just hit save, and that commits all those changes to this sample number. And finally, we have a history tab, and this just logs information you enter into your sample description and any changes that you are making. It will not show up on your sample report. So now that all the information has been entered, the model will be ready to go once we've analyzed the fecal sample and have the forage quality data. If you're sending in a fecal sample with what we call, this is a pre-logged fecal sample, so you, the client, have logged it in ahead of us, we ask that you print out a sample form, and again, I'll go back. Just to get back to that sample form, you would hit the sample form button and it will produce this form, give you an option to print it. If you're sending in multiple samples in one box, make sure that each sample is labeled with this number to identify it. And then finally, if you've created the sample information and made the sample number, but then you don't end up sending in a sample to go with it, or a lot of time passes and well, I guess first of all, if a lot of time passes and information changes before you end up sending in a sample, you can always go back and edit all of this information, remove profiles, remove feeds, change the pasture to a different pasture, and it will use the same number, but you can essentially change all of the information. Even the date can be changed. But if you just end up not sending in a sample altogether, you can opt to delete this sample, and it will remove this number. However, once we receive the sample, so if the fecal sample arrives and we start processing it, the delete option will not be available anymore. Another thing to note is that if you've created the sample number and the sample description, but we don't receive that sample to be associated with that number to start being processed, after 40 days from creating the number, it will be automatically deleted by our system. Alright, that is how to enter our sample description. Again, even though our physical sample sheets look a lot different from this online sort of form, the fields are the same, the information you would put there are the same, so you could use what you've learned through here if you're just wanting to do the physical sample sheets. With that, thanks for listening. I hope this was helpful. And again, feel free to get in touch with us and ask any more questions that you might have.